Welcome in, everyone. We're going to call this meeting to order. It is 7 p.m. on May 23rd, and this is a public meeting of the City of Portland's Police Accountability Commission. If the Spanish language interpreters, Maria and Thalia, can please give the information in Spanish language interpretation now, that would be lovely.
Hoy empezamos la reunión de la responsabilidad policíaca, son las 7 de la noche, ya va a empezar la reunión. Okay.
Thank you so very much. Yep.
Okay.
So thank you so much. The city also offers ASL interpretation, which is being provided by Andrea and Amanda. You can pin their video feed if that is helpful to you. Finally, the closed captioning is turned on in Zoom as another means of assistance. Please note that this is an automatic captioning service and it is not always accurate. The city supports access to meetings of the Police Accountability Commission and can provide other language support as well. Please email in advance of future public meetings, either as a response to a public meeting notice or directly to policeaccountability@portlandoregon.gov to ask for other access assistance, including interpretation into other languages. This meeting is a public meeting subject to the City of Portland Administrative Code and Oregon state law and is being recorded. For this meeting, the chat function is enabled for commission members to communicate with each other. Members of the public will be able to ask questions using Zoom's Q&A feature. As the commissioners are presenting and or discussing things, if attendees have questions, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A. We hope to use this feature to guide our conversation during the evening and future meetings and agenda topics. We'd like to be clear that not all questions will be answered during the meeting, but if answered, both the question and the answer will be visible to you and will become part of the meeting record. To access this feature, just click on the Q&A icon in the middle of your screen. Next slide, please. The purpose of our land acknowledgement is to center the traditional native inhabitants of the land upon which we live. We respectfully acknowledge the Chinook, the Clatskanie, the Kalapuya, and the Multnomah and the Clackamas, two tribal nations who are missing from this map, who are now part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde because of the genocide that occurred in the creation of this country. We honor those who have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and we pay our personal respect to their elders, both past and present. Next slide, please. Holly will pass this over to the co-chairs to discuss the timeline.
I'm sorry, that's me. I'm trying to eat dinner as fast as I can. Good evening, everyone. My name is Faith Aiken. I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of the co-chairs for this phase of the Police Accountability Commission. So a quick overview of our timeline. You'll see that from December 2021 through March 2022, we were in the organizational phase. Where we are right now in May is in the fact-finding phase that will last until July 2022. Additional phases are coming, April 2022 to 2023, and we will go to council for their consideration in 2023. Today, May 23rd, we are going to be hearing from Independent Police Review and Citizen Review Committee. We'll be focusing on understanding the current IPR and CRC processes, identifying barriers to police accountability and best practices in the current process, and we'll also have public comment. Coming up on May 26th, we have our meeting focus. We're hearing from a briefing from Mayor Ted Wheeler. We'll have public comment. June 2nd, we have an accountability meeting. And also coming forward in the fact-finding phase are continuing to identify barriers to police accountability, summary of suggestions from our experts, summary of the models we've explored, and suggested charter changes to recommend to the Charter Commission if there are any.
So I can take over on this part. Hi, everyone. I'm Lavisa Lloyd. I use she, her pronouns. I'm also a co-chair of the full commission for the fact-finding phase. And I just want to say welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And also, this is such an exciting day. So this slide is right now the current project plan for the fact-finding phase. And I just want to stress that it's not set in stone. It's really more for members to just be able to understand how the commission is going to move through this phase and get to the end of the phase, which the goals of this phase focus on identifying areas of agreement among the commission members as to barriers to accountability in the current system, best practices from Portland and other jurisdictions, and suggestions to consider from experts, as well as, of course, taking public comment and meeting with and hearing from key stakeholders. Today's meeting is in the yellow highlighted text in the light blue box near the center of the screen. So you'll see it says IPRCRC. That's where we are right now.
Thank you so very much. We're going to read now the community agreements, and I would love to have a volunteer read this first paragraph for us, and then popcorn over, pick another commission member to read the next two. And so we're just gonna take the first paragraph, somebody's gonna take the first paragraph and then popcorn over to a commissioner to read the next two, and then they're gonna popcorn over to someone else, pretty please. Who would like to start us off?
I will start if you like.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Carney.
The Police Accountability Commission agrees to approach its work with honesty, openness, and willingness to work together to develop and achieve shared goals. The commission will work with each other, city staff support, and external support to address issues as they arise, communicate openly, and meet each other's needs as part of working to meet the city's needs as a commission. All commission members, as well as city staff support and external support, will abide by these agreements as we perform the duties and mandates of the commission. And I am going to popcorn over to Tirsa.
Thank you.
Our expectations of ourselves and of each other include keep the needs and concerns of the local community and the larger region at the forefront of the work. And Catherine, you're first on my screen.
Thank you. Always confront oppression. Keep focus on the objectives of the meetings and individual agenda items. Utilize facilitators to note additional topics for discussion. Let's see, how about May?
Arrive on time and be prepared to the best of your ability. Give notice if you are unable to attend a meeting. I will popcorn it over to Eric.
Let's see. Keep multitasking to a minimum. Contribute to the overall success of the group by finding ways to participate that best meet your needs. And I will pop it over to, can't see the screen. How about Jason? Or how about Debbie?
Allow those who participate in different ways or have types of participation or tasks they are responsible for to fulfill their roles. How about Monica?
Okay, model appropriate behavior, treating everyone with dignity and respect, and promoting an ethical, equitable, and inclusive culture free from all forms of harassment.
Thank you. Monica, one more, and then who's next after that?
All right, yes. Wholeheartedly uplift and support the commission, our colleagues, and our collaborators, and portray them positively rather than casting them in an unfavorable light. I'll hand it over to Winta.
Sure. Act with awareness that our actions could harm our colleagues and collaborators who have the right to be free from being unfairly criticized or cast unfavorably, and provide space for minority viewpoints and legitimate concerns without decisions and actions, as well as complaints about conduct without reprisal. I'll pass it to CMOB.
Listen without agenda and refrain from interruptions. Be polite, courteous, and thoughtful. Keep in mind that everyone has their own truth.
Who's next, Seema?
I will popcorn over to Jason. If his mic is. All right, how about Monica?
I'll do more. Okay. Assume good intentions from our colleagues and collaborators. Challenge ideas rather than individuals. Approach different opinions with curiosity. Seek to understand. Use I statements. Charlie.
Affirm other speakers. Do not use violent words. Instead, say something positive about the previous speaker and simply add your own thoughts. Respect privacy. Everything shared in confidence needs to be kept in confidence. I can't see anybody that hasn't already spoke. Someone like to volunteer?
I can volunteer. Honor the decisions of the group, even if they are not your preferred outcome. You might not personally agree with every decision. Do not overstate or mischaracterize the work, level of agreement, or progress of the commission, and accept non-closure.
Thank you so very much, everyone. Really important for us to lean into these community agreements as you have spent time and deep work on creating them and just making sure that we're living the values that you have identified. So thank you so very much for that. So co-chairs, next slide, please. I would love for you to take us through this overview.
All right, today's meeting. We're going to start with a briefing with the Independent Police Review. Ross Caldwell and Dana Walton-McCauley, Director and Assistant Director of IPR, will give us a briefing, including a presentation, and we'll have some question and answer time. We'll have a briefing with the Citizen Review Committee. Candace Avalos and Yumi Delegato, Chair and Vice Chair of the CRC, will give a presentation, and we'll also have Q&A. And then we'll open up for public comment, and we will close with discussions on barriers to police accountability and best practices.
Thank you. We'll now move into the briefing with the Independent Police Review. Please allow me to introduce Ross Caldwell, Director of IPR, and Dana Walton-McCauley, Assistant Director of IPR. I'll give you the floor at this time.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, and thank you all for the time and work you put into this. Obviously an important subject. I'm Ross. I've been in IPR since Dana and I started around the same time, kind of mid to late 2019. So we're about 2.5, almost 3 years in, I guess, to be in IPR. Dana, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having us. I'm Dana Walton McCauley, and I'm the Deputy Director of IPR, and looking forward to having a quick conversation with you all about our work and accountability in the city and answering any questions you all may have for us.
Yeah, so we've got a number of subjects that we were asked to touch on here. The first one up, and probably the most kind of complicated, I guess, is just how the investigation process works with IPR and internal affairs currently. It's pretty confusing, not terribly intuitive. So I think we'll start with that, and Dana and I will just kind of talk about it together. I know we're set up to have 20 minutes to present and 10 minutes for questions, but because we're covering a bunch of different subjects, if it's okay, it might be easier if people just want to jump in with questions or raise your hand or whatever. Otherwise, it might be kind of hard to come back to stuff. So I'll let you all decide how you want to do that. And if we're speaking too quickly for ASL or anything, please give me some kind of emoji face that told me to slow down and I'll try to comply. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see that kind of flow chart thing? Okay. So to start off with, IPR has been around for just a little over 20 years. And originally, I think IPR, from what I've been told, just kind of took complaints from community members and sent them across the street to the police bureau. They didn't really provide a whole lot of service to the community. And over time, it's kind of evolved to add more powers and responsibilities and ability to get information and things like that. And so I don't know if it's entirely because of that, because like I said, Dana and I have been around for years, but we have evolved a very, very complicated process for how our investigations flow. So I'm going to try to go over that kind of briefly here. And if anything is not making sense, or if you have any definitional questions or anything like that, please let me know.
Director Caldwell, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but your audio is like a little echoey. Do you know? Do you have any headphones or anything like that?
I don't actually. Is that any better now?
Hold on, try it again.
Any better now? Testing.
That's maybe slightly better. That might be a little bit better.
If
Yeah,
anything, you sound a little bit distant.
Okay. Move my mic a little closer. All right, please let me know if it pops up again.
Okay, that's
okay. Thank you. So to start with, we have a person making a complaint. We take complaints pre-pandemic. We took complaints in person at City Hall. We're on the first floor, just kind of to the right as you go in. We also take complaints by an online tracket form, by email, by letter, by phone, kind of any way that you can reach us. We'll take your complaint. And if somebody prefers to speak to us in person but can't get down to City Hall, we can always send an investigator out. We have a little interview room in City Hall. We're hoping that soon City Hall will be open to the public again, because there are some exceptionally vulnerable members of the community that don't have access to phones or emails or things like that. They prefer to come talk to our investigators face to face in our office. So that's currently something we're not able to do due to the pandemic, but we're hoping that City Hall will be open to the public soon and we'll have that ability restored. So once somebody makes a complaint, we have kind of an intake investigation period. And that period is where our investigators reach out to the complainant and just try to understand what they're trying to say, what their interaction with police was, what they didn't like about it. And what we're trying to do at that point is we're trying to do the kind of the very initial phases of allegation formation. So we conduct administrative investigations, obviously. And in order to conduct an administrative investigation, you have to at some point have an allegation that somebody had violated an administrative rule. In our case, the administrative rules are the Portland Police Bureau directives, which I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with at this point. And so we try to our investigators try to speak to a complainant and say, what happened? When was it? Where were you? Do you know the name of the officer? What did you dislike about their behavior? Are we talking about, for instance, the use of force or racial profiling? Are we talking about someone being discourteous, or somebody you think maybe not following through on their job, or not writing an adequate report or something like that? Prior to 2020 and to the pandemic, we averaged about 400 complaints a year from the community. And then we had another 50 to 80 complaints a year that would come in from the police bureau. So that was for members of PPB about other members of PPB. I think we're going to talk about that a little later on. Since the pandemic, when the protests were happening, we had a huge amount of contacts from the public, some of which were complaints, some of which were kind of more general, just feelings about law enforcement or about the protests or about the city of Portland or things like that. We were getting thousands and thousands of contacts from people all over the country and kind of all over the political spectrum, which is really challenging. And we kind of try to distill those down into, did you have an interaction with a police bureau member or did you not? So once we have that information, our investigators have 14 days to conduct what we call an intake investigation. And our 14 days, all these little kind of parenthetical timelines that you see here, these are all a result of the Department of Justice settlement agreement with the city. So we have kind of all these different stage timelines that we have to meet in our investigation. And so that first period is for our investigator, that first 14 days is for our investigator to reach out to the complainant, try to understand what happened, what their experience was, what they didn't like, and then try to come up with an allegation. And then also in that time, we pull any kind of police bureau records that we can get our hands on. And those are often, we usually start with a dispatch from 911 from POIC to the police bureau to say like, okay, this person doesn't know the name of the officer they interacted with, but it was on 3rd and Main, and it was around 10 p.m. on Saturday night, or it could have been the next night, we're not sure. So we can kind of pull all the 911 calls from that time, and we can try to figure out which officers were dispatched to which calls and who was where within a given time to try to limit, who could this officer be? We can also kind of look up and see when somebody's name was run in order to check, what was the officer that had contact with this person. Sometimes we get anonymous complaints, and so that doesn't work as well because the complainant don't want us to know who they are, much less the police to know who they are, so that can present some additional challenges. But that's kind of our initial phase to get that information. From there, we pull any police reports that we can. Often police will maybe not necessarily write a report if there wasn't an arrest or if there wasn't, if there was kind of a brief interaction. But it could nonetheless be something that we get a complaint about. And so in those instances, we pull how they say the call was completed. And there are various codes. I'm not sure if you've looked into this kind of stuff yet, but for every call from 911 to police, there are various codes that kind of close out the call. The call could be closed out as assignment was completed, or assignment was completed, there was an arrest made, which would indicate a report would have to have been written, or it can say assignment completed, no arrest, or assignment completed, no report written, or something like that. There's a huge variety of kind of those things. So we sort of try to piece all that together. If we are not able to find the information and kind of identify an officer that way, we also have the option of tracking officers' vehicles with GPS. Whenever officers are logged into their patrol vehicles, as long as they're logged in, there is a GPS that's activated, and we can get that information from the police bureau. And if we have somebody that says they were, pulled over on 82nd at a certain time of night, they don't know who the officer was, we can see who was in that vicinity at that time with a relative degree of certainty. So that can really help us to kind of track down who the officer could have been. And so we have our investigators kind of write that up into kind of an intake investigation package for us to make an initial decision on. Dana, is there anything you want to add to that piece? That kind of
yeah, just real quick, I think, can you all hear me okay? Okay, one of the things that I think is kind of important to keep in focus for this part of the investigation or this part of the process is the notion that it is set up to respond to complaints coming in. And during the protests, we kind of had to shift our posture to kind of going out, and we opened a lot of complaints on our own. But I think that just kind of keeping in mind that this all is set up in a responsive posture as opposed to a proactive posture. So that's just something to keep in the back of your minds as you all are doing this work.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you. We kind of we respond to complaints, and so the protest did create a huge, kind of a huge problem with that. We do have the authority to open investigations without a complaint. under city code, we're entirely a creature of city code, so we have the, the powers and the abilities that city council has given to IPR over the years. And so we can open complaints on our own without waiting for a complaint for someone. And we did that a lot during the protests, as Dana alluded to. If we saw a video that we thought was troubling, we would open an investigation and try to figure out who that was. Often that meant that we were opening investigations without having a complainant. And so we had very limited information. We would have a video, but we didn't know who the community member in the video was. Sometimes we didn't know where the video, took place. We usually didn't know who the police officer was or what law enforcement agency they were with, but we would start with the video and kind of try to work our way back from there. So that's the protests are a whole other animal that will probably eat up too much of our time here to talk about, unless anybody has any specific questions. So I'm going to keep moving to the next step of this, unless anybody has a question before we go on. Okay. So in that initial phase, we have some things that can be sent out for a supervisory investigation, or what we call a precinct referral. Precinct referral is when we don't find any violation of a directive, but it's something that we might be hearing a lot about, like community members saying, hey, there's my kids go to this school and it's not too far from East Precinct, and people drive, cops are driving really fast by this school and they're turning their lights and sirens on, and I think it's really concerning. I think it disrupts the kids and someone could be hurt or something like that. So if it's something that we look into and we find, they have the authority to do that under their directives, there's not anything we can really do about it. We can send it over to the police bureau to let them know this is a concern, and they can have someone reach out to that community member if they decide. That's something we can send to the precinct referral. Supervisory investigations, those are kind of for low-level complaints. They couldn't apply to something like racial profiling or use of force. They could apply to something like courtesy. Like I called 911. This officer came out because I wanted to report my car stolen, and I think he didn't take me seriously, and he was discourteous. He was rude to me, or it seemed like he was in a rush and didn't want to listen. That would be a low-level complaint that could be handled through a supervisory investigation, for example. So there are some kind of off ramps at that point. So generally, once an intake investigation comes in after that 14-day period, we then have a period of time to figure out what we want to do with that. And then from there, the tree branches in a lot of different directions. So we can admin close the case, which means that it will not get any further investigation. Oh, sorry, Catherine, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just wonder, as you're going through this, it would be helpful for me to understand what parts of this are confidential, what's public record, how, if a complaint is made, is the complaint public record and the complaint identified to the public, no matter what his or her wishes are. Just, it would be useful for me to understand that piece as you're going through it. Thank you.
Yeah, some of this could probably be obtained through a public records request, but I think a lot of this is pretty well protected. A lot of the people that make complaints with us are people that are having frequent interactions with law enforcement and maybe, have a lot of contact with the criminal justice system. And so there's a lot of privacy issues for those people. Someone can make a complaint anonymously. They can make a complaint where they don't tell us who they are, or they can make a complaint and say, I really don't want the officer to know who I am. And we can take that as far as we can. But there are stages of an investigation where, due to the rules of our system, the officer does have a right to know kind of who's accusing them of misconduct. And so it can be pretty complicated. Once you get to a named officer, an involved officer, there are a lot of privacy protections that can apply to that kind of stuff. And there are often public records requests to try to obtain those things, and those go through the city attorney's office. And so that is handled through the kind of the public records process. But we try to put out as much information as we're allowed to put out under, public records law. The union contract has a big impact on that, obviously. And then, there are kind of various provisions. It gets pretty tricky because you're dealing with union contract, state law, city code. There's kind of a lot of overlapping rules in kind of all aspects of our work that really determine what we can talk to who about. So we can often talk about, if somebody calls us and said, hey, I saw this crazy video on the news last night of a car, police vehicle smashing through a barricade. are you guys doing anything? We can say, yeah, we're investigating that, or no, we haven't heard about it yet. And we can go from there. But we couldn't tell somebody, for example, what officer was alleged to have been driving the vehicle and is facing potential misconduct allegations. So it's pretty tricky. That's about as good of a squishy answer as I can probably give you. Okay, continuing on, please let me know if there's any follow-up questions for you. So one option after an intake investigation is that a case is administratively closed. The number one reason a case is administratively closed is because everything that the complainant says, even if we can prove that it's all accurate, does not violate the Portland Police Bureau directives. So there are a lot of things that police do that people don't like. People don't like when they're arrested on warrants. They don't like various things. And we get a lot of complaints about those kind of things. But that doesn't mean that it's a violation of PPB directive. And so if it doesn't break the rules, our job as administrative investigators is to compare Portland Police Bureau member behavior to Portland Police Bureau directives. And so if that behavior does not violate the directives, that's not something we're going to be able to further investigate. We might send it as a precinct referral, or we might send it over to higher ups of the Bureau and say, hey, we're hearing a lot of people that are upset about this particular thing. You guys might want to kind of take a look at how you're carrying this out. You might want to give more information. You might want to explain a little better. So we do that very regularly. The other thing we do with this, and this is something that we'll probably get into later if we have time, if we see a lot of complaints about something that's not a violation of a directive, we can open a policy review. And a policy review is just our way to say, like, hey, we're looking at, like we're currently working on a domestic violence policy review to see, what kind of training police bureau officers receive. Is it trauma informed? How do people in the community feel about that? How do victims advocates feel about that? They feel like, people are getting the service that they want that they have. So it's not necessarily the end of the road when there's not anything that alleges misconduct, but it means that we can't really meaningfully further investigate. Monica, give your hand up.
Yes, a quick question. What is the percentage of complaints that end up closed at this stage, would you say?
If I remember right, it's, all the protest cases have really kind of muddied all of our normal percentages, but I want to say before the protest cases started, I wanted to say something around 36%, I want to say 36%, or maybe a little higher. Dana, does that sound right to you? I want to say it was somewhere in like more than a third.
Okay.
And we, people can make a complaint for any reason. We try to make it as kind of wide as a doorway as possible. But that does mean you get a lot of complaints which do not allege misconduct. And so it's kind of, you can try to put some parameters around that and narrow down what can come in your door, but then you're going to be screening out people that, I think we try to be very careful about putting magic words around this. Like you have to say a certain thing that will get you to the next stage. And that's why our investigators are trained to reach out and really trying to get kind of a holistic understanding of what someone is complaining about and what they're alleging. I'm not sure who was next. Whoever wants to go to the next question.
Mob.
C-Mob and then Charlie.
Hey, greetings, Ross. So my question was very similar to Monica's. What I was thinking was, and you don't have to spit it all out, but you guys have percentages and metrics like at least a percentage of like pre-2020 and post-2020 in each one of these forms of review and as far as outcomes?
Yeah, we have dashboards on our website, and the dashboards try to map out the things that we, have some say over. And so, as part of this process, once we get to the end of this flow chart, we don't, IPR is not empowered to make any discipline decisions. We can make recommendations, and that's a power that IPR got several years ago but didn't originally have. So we can make recommendations, but we don't ultimately decide if someone's in or out of policy. And so the final, who was disciplined and what their discipline was, that's tracked by the police bureau because that decision was made by the police chief, and then the mayor ultimately as the police commissioner. But we do have, all this information. The reason that I kind of gave that caveat about the protest cases kind of muddying the statistics is because, normally pre-2020 and the racial justice protests, the number one complaint, the biggest complaints that we got, the most common complaints were conduct and courtesy, which are fairly low level compared to something like use of force or racial profiling. Once we got into the protests, we opened a ton of force allegation complaints. And so that kind of, if you look at those cases, you'll see a ton of force cases. And that's just really not what IPR had seen as much pre-protest. So the protests were a very, very, very different time for all this stuff. And I think just for there's so many people interacting with police at the protests that didn't normally interact with police at all. So it was the stats are kind of all over the place when it comes to that.
Charlie?
Hi, Ross. My question is, can you give me a couple of examples of policy reviews that ended in some kind of change?
Yeah, I can put a link when I get done with this. Sorry, I've got a small kind of whiny dog sitting here with me. When I get to the end of this, I can put a list of our policy reviews up on. We've got those all on our website, and so you can kind of go through and look at those. But we've done policy reviews. I think the most recent ones we've done were about people for whom English was not their first language, and how the police bureau trains, and then how it makes use of the language line, and how it tries to get officers, who may speak that language and interact with community members so that they can get more accurate reporting and have kind of a higher and better level of service. We've done kind of very small specific ones about officers using the flashlight that can be attached to a gun as a way of clearing a room, basically using a weapon as a flashlight. We've done kind of small ones like that. We're currently working on a domestic violence one, as I mentioned earlier. We put out one that was kind of related to how the accountability system didn't do very well. We've asked some of the reasons behind that. I don't know, Dina, do you have some other examples?
Not specifically, but what I was going to say is, like, all of the policy reviews that we have published, the police bureau writes a response, like they get an opportunity to see what our recommendations are, and then they respond to that before it's published so that you can see what the bureau's response is, and they can say, we agree with this, or go kick rocks, or whatever their response is, and if they plan to make policy changes as a result of that. So
is that a really long and arduous process to do that?
To get the recommendations back from the police bureau?
To actually result in some positive change?
I think it depends on the level of, it depends on the recommendation that we're making. And so, for example, if we made a recommendation to, mark certain patrol cars with a sticker, that's a pretty high speed, low drag change that it's really easy for them to make, so that, they can note these cars have ballistic panels, these cars don't. Or changing the directive though around like how stolen vehicles are processed, that's a lot more complicated because that entails state law and other things outside of just how officers are expected to respond. So it depends a lot on how detailed and how involved the policy is outside of the bureau itself. Did I say that in a way that makes sense?
Yeah. Okay. And I can look some of these up on your website.
Yes.
Okay.
We are close to out of time.
Yeah, if I can step in right here. I know that Q&A was actually an agenda item, and so we went in with some Q&A already. So we can probably extend you guys an extra 10 minutes if you're okay with that. If everybody else is okay with that.
Yeah, I'd go another 10 minutes, CMOB.
I'll try to go quicker through this part. One thing I just wanted to mention, one of the big years ago, before Dana and I were here, there was a policy review on PPD having a Brady policy, which is an incredibly important part of the criminal justice system. And that wasn't just IPR trying to get that done. There were, the DOJ weighed in on that. A lot of other people weighed in on that. And that was a lot of the attorney's office and a lot of other people in the city. But it has resulted in a Brady policy, which has been a huge list and has taken several years. And it's incredibly important. So, it's not just us. Sometimes we can call attention to things, and other people like the folks at CRC or PSEP or other groups will kind of connect to that. So we try to put things out there, and then sometimes they echo back, sometimes it's years later, sometimes it's different. Okay, so trying to speed this up a little bit. So in this review period, cases can be closed, they can be sent for a supervisory investigation, which I talked about a little bit earlier. And that's where a sergeant would reach out to the complainant and ask what they're complaining about, and then conduct an investigation of an officer that they supervise. And those only can happen for very kind of low level complaints. They're usually for courtesy complaints or something like that, someone who was discourteous. We can also refer a case for full investigation, which is where we keep the case and continue the investigation, or we can send it over to internal affairs and they can do the investigation. We have kind of as we go further down this chart here, we have kind of a mirrored process with internal affairs where we can conduct investigations and they can conduct investigations. And if we conduct the investigation, internal affairs has to review it and say, okay, I think you asked all the questions. I think you did it in a fair way. It's okay to go out for people to make their recommended findings on. If internal affairs conducts the investigation, we do the same thing, where we say, yep, I think you talked to all the witnesses. I think you asked them all the right questions. I think you did it in a fair and unbiased way. And now it's ready to go out for people to make recommended findings on. At that point, once the investigation is done, people make recommendations. It starts with the responsible unit manager. We're kind of down here on our crazy chart now. The responsible unit manager. So if the officer works, in a certain part of the police bureau, it's ultimately kind of someone higher up the chain from them that will make their initial finding on whether or not the officer violated policy or not. We then have the opportunity we can agree to that, or we can controvert, which sends it to the police review board, or we can add a debrief. So there's several different things we can do. From there, we kind of get into the police review board, which is another kind of separate topic, and further recommendations that are made from there. And then ultimately, those decisions can be appealed to the Citizen Review Committee, and then you're going to hear from them later tonight. And just kind of the other caveat I would say with this before we try to move on to the next thing or further questions, is just that we conduct the investigations, we can make recommendations, but we can't force the police bureau or the police commissioner to make a decision one way or another. We can say, we can build our best case, we can argue in the police review board, and we can say, this is why we think this officer is out of policy. Here's our reason, here's the part of the directive, blah, blah, blah. But we ultimately can't make the decision, make a recommendation. Debbie, do you have a question?
I feel like you've just scratched the surface, and I'm wondering if you would consider coming back for part 2 at a future date.
Yeah, that's fine with me. This stuff is massively complicated. So to talk about any of it in any detail that I think would be helpful is going to take a very, very long time, unfortunately. I don't know a better way to kind of impart our experience, but yeah, happy to.
And I feel like we could, with all that and all your experiences, you could fill up an entire meeting with, discussion and explanation. Thanks.
A helpful thing for us is just to let us know what specifically you want to know about, and probably the more tailored, the easier it is for us to talk about it in a way that doesn't go all over the place and eat up too much of your time. Dan or Charlie?
Ross, I'm going to call on Charlie, and then I'm going to call on Dan.
Hi again. I wanted to ask how many of those recommendations are actually do they take? And that you make, that IPR makes.
I don't know a percentage. It often takes a long time to hear what what the chief's office decides to do with something, but I think we do have a pretty good track record. Often, not all the time, but I think that we, I don't know. I'm not sure the exact. We're kind of working on a project right now to look at some of the accountability systems and to look at how police review boards, kind of how their recommendations are followed, and try to come up with some better stats on that. So we'll have.
How about police shootings?
On police shootings, I mean, I think we're gonna get to that in a little bit. I think that's our next thing. We do sit on the police board and we do make recommendations. So I think that they kind of listen to everybody there. I don't know that we can get into any specifics on any individual cases. Dana, do you have anything you want to add on that, or do you want to wait till we get into it next?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the PRB recommendations, it's hard to kind of quantify that because it involves a couple of circles that we're not necessarily in on at the time that they happen. It requires kind of a retrospective look. And so no, I don't have anything substantive to add there.
Yeah, I think we can give you more information about the police review board specifically. That's a very, very large topic, and it's hard to give short answers to really complicated questions. I feel like on some of the protest cases, we've had pretty good luck making our arguments. The important thing to remember about the police review board is that you have multiple people in there and they don't have to agree. You can have, one person saying one thing, everybody else saying another thing. And all of those recommendations go in a memo to the police chief. And so you don't necessarily have to convince anyone or win them over. You just have to make your point and kind of get it on the record. So it's a very weird thing that happens completely out of the public eye. There are community volunteers, and if it's a use of force case, there's volunteers from the CRC that attend. But other than that, it's not open to the public. They do put reports out on it later, but nobody can kind of go watch that how the discussion happens, which I think is one of the big issues with the system. We'll get to that more later.
Thank you so much. Winta.
I think Commissioner Handelman was before me.
That's okay. Go right ahead.
Okay. So thank you for this presentation. We've had, I think, some time to think about ways it could be better, certainly, but are there elements of the system that are particularly strong or that you would encourage us to think about incorporating into the new board?
I think for me, the biggest thing is I know how hard it can be to try to find some of these records that our investigators know how to kind of ferret out from the police bureau. And it's incredibly difficult, and there's some amazing expertise there. You can have kind of whoever you want making the disciplined decision, but you need really, really good, really experienced administrative investigators, because our investigators deal with a lot of people, who deal with a lot of trauma and have had a lot of difficult interactions with the criminal justice system, and are contacting us to talk about that. And that takes real skill to conduct a good interview and try to get the information you need for an administrative investigation. On the other side, you're dealing with the police, and they're not always easy to deal with either. And so it's kind of challenging in all directions. And so I think whatever the structure of the new thing is, you really, 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 really need good administrative investigation experience and expertise with how the police bureau functions, and just like I was talking about before, knowing how to get that GPS info to figure out what officer could have been there, knowing what kind of reports to run to figure out a little bit more about this 911 call, because the trail kind of goes cold after that. That's incredibly valuable. That's one thing I think that if you don't have that, you're not going to accomplish much. The good thing is we're going to have body cameras before too long. And I think we're kind of fumbling around in the dark without that, and have been for a long time. And so I think that's going to be a sea change in all of this, but you're still going to need to know which body camera, which video to look at. And so I think that expertise is really important. I don't know, Dana, is there anything you want to add to
that? No. Well, I'm trying to decide, because Jason asked us to talk about the makeup of the staff. And right now we have, 7 investigators, a lead investigator, an investigations coordinator, and then Ross. I'm the deputy director. I'll be leaving at the beginning of next month. So they'll be a little bit more short-staffed. So that's our current staff composition right now.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Handelman and then Commissioner Glenn, and then we're going to go to public comment.
Thank you. Yes, Dan Handelman, I use he, him pronouns. Of course, I'm familiar with IPR's work, and I reviewed the auditor's analysis of some of the hurdles. You mentioned just a second ago about the records that you have to track down, and I think last year the state legislature passed something to make it easier for IPR to access records, even though you're not technically a law enforcement agency. But I believe I've heard you say that there are still barriers to you getting those records. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so IPR has been told for a long time before Dana and I worked here that we could not get direct access to police reports. So we can't go do a search within the police report database on our own. We have to make a request for what we think we're looking for to Portland Police Bureau records, and they will then do a search for us and tell us what they find. When you do things that way, it's really hard to know if you've looked everywhere or not. And so you end up, like one of our investigators calls it friction. You end up with a lot of friction where you have to make multiple requests. You have to kind of look every way that you think you might need to look in order to find it. Not trying to throw PPP records under the bus. You know, they didn't make these rules any more than we made these rules. They just have to play by them the same way that we do. But it's massively inefficient. It's really hard for them. It's challenging for us. So we requested a bill to include oversight bodies in the definition of a criminal justice agency so that we would not be precluded from having direct access to data and information that contains LEDS material. And LEDS is the law enforcement data system. So it's, you know, it's very, a lot of privacy concerns about having that information out there in the world. So it's very carefully protected. There's a lot of federal protections as well as at the state level. So we got that bill passed. We tried before. I think it's been tried before multiple times, and it never got through. But we got that. We got it passed this time with some help from some folks in the legislature, and we are now working our way through some of the steps with Oregon State Police. Oregon State Police is kind of the keeper of LEDs for the state, and so we're going to have to satisfy several of their, I think, probably security protocols and things like that. We've been trying to get a meeting with them for quite a while now since our bill passed to try to make that happen. And we finally have a meeting set up with them, but it's not till late June to kind of take those next steps. So we're hoping that soon we will be able to, you know, soonish we'll be able to have direct access to police reports, do our own searches, and that'll kind of increase our efficiency for the way that this works.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Glenn.
Yes, thank you so much. I had some questions as well on the audit. I was looking over that, and Dan brought up one of them about having access to the records, direct access. But there were there were 4 items. I just wanted to know if you guys could expand on that a little bit. There was one discussing having a member of the board being, how should I say, present, and also having these reviews done outside of the police facilities. I would like you to talk a little bit about that audit in general, and if you could just give us a summary about how well that's gone with the reforms, and what other work we might need to do as the new commission or the new board comes along. Thank you.
Can I clarify, sorry, by the audit, are you referring to the materials that the auditor put on the website about kind of barriers to?
Yes.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It was in our pre-reads for this meeting.
Okay, yeah. So I think the genesis of where that material comes from is when Dana and I started, we kind of worked here long enough to learn how things were working, and we had put our heads together and said, what do we think needs to be improved about this process? It's not very transparent. You know, there's a lack of accountability in several aspects of it. And, you know, we don't really think people are going to believe in something they can't see. So how can we improve this? And so we worked with the then general counsel in the auditor's office and with Mary, the auditor, to come up with a list of things that we thought needed to be improved. And that's where that list came from. So it's not, I mean, not to be overly technical, I'm sorry if this is an annoying way to say it, but it's not technically an audit. it's a list of things we think need to be approved. One of those was direct access to police reports. And so that's the one that I was answering Dan's question about getting, the leads bill and all that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of other things in there as far as like what we can talk about around our cases, that would require, I think, significant changes. I think it would require significant changes if we were doing them or if a new oversight board or body was doing them. And so that's just kind of a wish list of where we wanted to go. Not too long after that, the pandemic hit, we were trying to figure that out. And then the racial justice protest started after George Floyd was murdered. And so since then, we've been kind of hanging on by the skin of our teeth. And I don't, and then we had the ballot measure, and now we've got the new accountability board being put together. And so one of the reasons that we wanted to make sure we published all that, as opposed to just having that be our internal, kind of list of things to work on, so that it would be available to folks like you to say, all right, well, this is at least what this group of people who worked on this stuff thought, these are impediments to being able to put these things out there publicly. So that's kind of where that came from. Some of the things on there, I think you might have been referring to internal affairs being in the room when we conduct an interview. That's something that, under the current system, an internal affairs sergeant or lieutenant or captain, depending on the rank of the PPD member being interviewed, has to kind of order them to answer questions, because we don't have the authority as IPR, we're just other city employees. We don't have the authority to order them to answer questions truthfully. But, a higher ranking officer in the police bureau does have that authority. And so that's why that's there. If that's something that people wanted to change, we tried to kind of lay out some of the ways you could get to those changes. So I guess it's more of a venue for things you want to change. I don't know, Dana, is there anything you wanted to clarify or say better than that?
I think that's right on. It's like it's a menu of issues that we had kind of spotted. And it's a long-term, big picture level list. And so I think that all of the things that are on there, I would still say ring true for me. And I think that they're all important to making sure that accountability generally works moving forward.
Thank you so very much for that wonderful briefing and the deep detail and the wish list. And that is so very helpful. We're going to go ahead and go to public comment on the independent police review. And on this briefing, we ask members of the public to keep their comments to 2 minutes in length and raise their hand in Zoom if you would like to speak.
For the question in the chat, yeah. I'm sorry, I'm trying to look up to Jason's question. Oh, were you referring just to the makeup of the IPR staff and kind of what works with that?
Okay, I'm going to go ahead, and because there was no public comment, I'm going to go ahead and let us go ahead and have this conversation, this robust conversation that we're all really leaning into. So yes, Ross, if you want to go ahead and answer CMOB's question that Jason brought up. Yes.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. And then I'm going to go to Monica, but go right ahead.
It's a big question.
And Ross, do you mind reading that out so we all can hear what the question is that you're responding to?
Sure. It says, to back up Jason's question, I'm also curious about the makeup of the investigators. What you see works and needs to change about it. This may be something that you'll have to get back to us after. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things. There's a lot of things we see that, I think when you have kind of limited access to things the way that we do in some ways, people get really clever and come up with a lot of workarounds. Like when you don't have your first choice, you kind of you kind of find ways to get around that. And so I think our investigators have gotten very clever about that, but you know, we're kind of on the brink of some really, really big changes. If we can get direct access to police reports, that'll be a big step. You know, when we have body cams, that's going to be a huge step. And I think that our investigators, or, you know, whoever is conducting, you know, those investigations at this point, is probably going to have to learn a whole new set of tricks, because body cameras are not going to be a silver bullet. They're not going to solve everything that we want solved, but they're going to be a huge, huge step. I think about like courtesy cases where, you know, we have a lot of cases where somebody complains and says, well, the officer said this to me. And the officer, when we interview them, they say, I didn't say that. I said this. And we kind of have he said, and that's it. And it's really hard to prove anything without an independent witness, or, you know, sometimes we're lucky and there's a video, and those are the cases that tend to be sustained. But when we don't have that, you often have kind of an unsatisfying result where you have like, well, we can't prove anything one way or another. I think with body cameras, we're going to have a lot more information to work with. And so, you know, depending on who's doing that, I think we're going to need to learn kind of like the new tricks to work with all that further information, and how to best get through all that video, because, you know, it's a ton of information, body cameras. You can often have 3 or 4 different videos from the same incident. Sometimes these incidents last an hour. And so it can be, you know, it's a lot of resources. So, you know, I think we can get into kind of the frustrations about how you build a case in an administrative investigation in this environment.
Thank you, Ross. That's so helpful. Monica, Commissioner Monica.
If you had, you know, you're doing this work in day in and day out all the time. If you had, do you have some insight into what would make the community feel like there's actual police accountability? What are the actual barriers for the community to feel trust in the system?
I think, Dana, go ahead.
I think that the transparency piece is huge there. And the other thing that I think that could help is to infuse restorative processes into this more. And I know that the confidentiality piece is a piece that has to be overcome in that, but I think that at its core, that's one of the reasons why the community doesn't necessarily feel a great sense of trust and accountability, because they don't know what the accountability really looks like behind closed doors, because it's behind the curtain. So that's if I had to pick a bullet, that's my bullet.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've seen some really great conversations in the police review board by peer officers all the way to higher ups in the bureau that do want to hold people accountable. And I've seen the opposite. But when nobody else gets to see it, you know, it's kind of no wonder that people don't have faith in it. You know, you're not going to trust that the government is here to help you with some other part of the government necessarily when you can't see that working.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Commissioner Handelman.
Oh, well, I heard you mention the word restorative, Director Caldwell, and I think, actually it was Assistant Director Walt McCauley, excuse me. But that made me think of the mediation program isn't on your flow chart. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the mediation program is kind of a diversion from that flow chart. And so during the intake process, if complainants are interested in pursuing mediation, then we will contact the officers who were involved if we know who they are, and then offer mediation as a potential resolution to the case. Mediation cases always wind up, they're not disciplinary. And so again, it takes the case off that chart in terms of being part of the disciplinary process. But again, I think that for a lot of community members, when they have a complaint, and if you're talking about courtesy or something like that, the opportunity to let the officer know how that interaction impacted you, your life, your day, your kids, whatever, really carries some weight and some value, probably outside of the notion of command counseling or a day off without pay or something like that, right? And so again, I think the kind of reframing what we're looking for, what the community wants, needs, and demands out of the accountability process is something to keep in mind as you consider how to infuse restorative processes into the accountability process.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go with Commissioner Charlie, and then our last commissioner who's going to ask a question is Debbie.
Thank you, Christine. So I understand you get complaints directly from the city's liaison to the Indigenous community. Is that correct?
We take complaints from anybody who sends them to us. We can certainly get a complaint from those folks. I don't know that it happens too often.
Oh, because I was going to ask, is there a different process or different steps or an extra step or something like that? All treated the same?
Well, yeah, we'll take a complaint any way that anybody wants to get it to us. Email, you know, I think we might even still have a fax line out there somewhere, but yeah, however people want to get it to us, and then we'll follow up. So, you know, even if somebody just calls and says, hey, I know somebody, this is their phone number, give them a holler, we'll do that. And we'll go out and, you know, meet people kind of where they are, if that's what they want us to do.
Yeah, because I'm just wondering if you have been like, have you interacted with that liaison group, and is there anything unique about it? So apparently, no.
No, not in my experience.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I've worked here and Dana has worked here, I should say, has been during the pandemic. And so, you know, we have kind of a weird, we've been here for kind of a weird time. And so some of the things that we see a lot of, other people probably didn't see that much of in previous years, and vice versa.
Thank you. Commissioner Debbie?
So I was wondering, you know, I think my sense is that it's fairly traumatic for many people to have to, you know, to have whatever the interaction with the police officer and then going through that whole process of the IPR or internal affairs overseas. So I'm curious if the steps that you may have taken or you think would be good to take to reduce the trauma that people experience when they're utilizing the system, and also any suggestions you have for making the system more culturally responsive.
You know, I think who works there is a huge part of it. Going to the last part first, you know, you have to be able to recruit a diverse workforce and people that, you know, can come at this from an open-minded place. And you know, because these are administrative investigations, they have to be built on evidence. They can't be built on opinion or anything like that. But you really need, you know, you really need people with kind of a variety of experiences. And we're really lucky to have that at IPR now. We have kind of people that come from all different directions. I think as far as making it less traumatic, you know, our investigators are trained in, you know, trauma-informed interviewing. Some of them have worked at DHS, some of them have worked at, you know, medical board, a whole bunch of have worked at kind of various places. Whenever possible, we try to hire people that have kind of experiences like that. And we really try to prioritize, you know, not only diversity, but also trauma-informed kind of ability to work with people that might be coming from a challenging place. I think it helps that we're in City Hall. I mean, I'm sure there's a better place that you can imagine, but we'll go meet people wherever we can meet them. We're not in Central Precinct. We're not in the Justice Center. Yeah, Dana, obviously amazing, great point. You know, and you know, we have several different languages that people at IPR speak. So we try to kind of do that as best we can. You know, we've got the reality is of our budget, so we don't have infinite resources to hire infinite people. But you know, I think the more you can make the place seem welcoming and as kind of not the police precinct as possible, I think those are big steps. We also really try to keep the cases with more vulnerable community members as much as we can. You know, and again, that gets into capacity issues. But you know, there's a lot of people who would talk to us, but they don't want to talk to an internal affairs investigator because they know that they're an employee of the police bureau. So we try to keep those ones as best we can.
Thank you so much for this evening's presentation. May, I'm sorry, and Jason, I'm sorry, unable to take your questions at this time. We're going to go ahead and take a break for 5 minutes, and then we're going to come back and have Candace and Yumi give us a presentation. And so I would love for all of us to thank Director Caldwell and Assistant Director McCauley for your time, your energy, your expertise, your compassion, all of the things that you bring to the table around this. Thank you so very much.
Thank you all for your work. We'll talk to you soon, I'm sure.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
8:15. Thank you. Thank you so much. Welcome back, everyone. We're now going to move to the briefing with the Citizen Review Committee. Please allow me to welcome Candace Avalos, Chair of the CRC, and Yumi Delgado, Vice Chair of the CRC. I'll give you the floor at this time. Understand that the presentation should last about 20 minutes, and then there's a Q&A at the end. So commissioners, if you could write down your questions as they occur to you, I'll be glad to facilitate the Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Good evening. Hello, everyone. My name is Candace Avalos, and my vice chair is here. Yume, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, Yumi Delgado, he, him, vice chair, CRC.
Great. And my pronouns are she, her. I've been on the CRC for 5 years now, and Yume, you're heading up 1 year, right, officially? Awesome. So we've got a wide range of experiences we can bring to the table based on me being there for a long time and Yume having a fresh perspective, having just joined in the last year. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here once I get this up. And we have a short presentation, and then we are happy to answer everyone's questions. All right. Okay, well, Yume, you're going to kick us off, so take it away.
Thanks, Candace. So just to give you kind of a brief overview of the CRC, the CRC has 11 members. It was created in 2001, and our goal is to help improve police accountability, promote higher standards of police services, and increase public confidence. Volunteer CRC members are appointed by City Council to perform 4 primary functions. One is to gather concerns about police services. 2 is to help the IPR director develop policy recommendations to address patterns of problems within the police and their conduct. 3 is to review and advise IPR and IA on the complaint handling process. And 4 is to hear appeals from complainants and officers and public report our findings. We also staff the police review process, which I think Ross alluded to in his presentation. So what do we actually do? Our most public facing duty is hearing appeals on cases, but that's probably a very small portion of the work that we actually do. On average, I think we hear maybe 2 or 3 appeals a year, at least in my experience with CRC thus far. We also work in independent work groups to develop policy, training, protocol recommendations. We gather feedback from the community on policing strategies. In the past, we've had sort of public town halls to do this. And we liaise with the IPR, Independent Police Review, and the City Council to develop long-term reform for the Bureau. Okay. So I'm going to have to squint a little bit here with this presentation, but as Ross discussed and Dana discussed in their presentation on the Independent Police Review, we don't deal with anything pertaining to civil litigation or criminal investigations. We don't make payments to complainants for property damages. We don't handle complaints against employees of any agency other than the Portland Police Bureau. IPR does deal with both administrative complaints and also complaints from the community. And I think Ross covered a lot of this in his presentation, so I don't want to rehash that unless you want me to. CRC exists within a sort of an ecosystem of police bureau advisory boards. We are unique in the fact that we are both an advisory board and an appeals board or an appellate body. Our fraternal organizations here include the African American, Muslim, Slavic, and Latinx Advisory Councils, the Equity and Inclusion Office, the Alliance for Safer Communities, the Training Advisory Council, or TAC, and the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing, or PSAP. Just a quick sort of distinction between a CRC appeal and the PRB process. I understand that this will be handled at a more detailed presentation, so just real high level. CRC appeals can come from typically from an IPR or internal affairs investigation. My understanding is that they can also come out of a police review board, but I've never experienced that happening. Those appeal hearings are public, although the case file is confidential. We are required on the CRC to use the reasonable person standard, which means we have to put ourselves in the mindset of what we call the responsible unit manager. So that's usually a precinct commander. There are 11 voting members. All of us are civilians. We're all appointed by city council. Our majority opinion is sent to the chief. We do not recommend disciplinary action. And if the chief chooses not to accept our recommendation, then we can appeal to city council. By contrast, a police review board is typically convened for what we call a contravene finding, which would be a situation where someone within the IPR or internal affairs chain of investigation disagrees with the Bureau's assessment of a case. They're also automatically convened for a use of deadly force or officer-involved shooting or an in-custody death. Those hearings are private. No members of the public are allowed in voting sessions. They use preponderance of evidence standard, right? Based on the facts provided, the preponderance of evidence indicates this finding. As Ross mentioned, there are typically 5 to 7 voting members. That's going to be the assistant chief of police. We have the responsible unit manager, as indicated, the head of IPR, and then usually 1 to 2 civilian members and 1 to 2 peer police officers. So you'll either have 2 police and 2 civilians, or 1 police and 1 civilian. I think it's important to note that this always means that the police have more votes than the civilians. These recommendations are sent to the chief, who is not obligated to accept the majority opinion. We do recommend discipline in that process, and those can be appealed. Like I said, my understanding is they can be appealed to CRC. PRBs actually make up a big chunk of what some CRC members end up having to do during their tenure on CRC, just because there's so many cases. Unfortunately, obviously, we've had a high number of officer-involved shootings in the last few years, and we have just a ton of protest cases that they're still working through. And I believe with that, I'll hand it back over to Candace.
All righty. Thanks, Yume. So just to talk a little bit about the questions that you all sent to us. So as far as experience with appeals, a couple of things to note. So often the cases come with a lot of information, and it's difficult to sift through what's most important. So I wanted to highlight that as you all are putting together this new body, because it's really important that there's some good training and support and mentorship to help people understand what these different documents mean. Some of them can be really technical. And a lot of times too, I mean, now that I've been here for 5 years, I know what's in the case file that needs like my attention, if you will, and what are things that I'm like, okay, these are kind of like standard procedure things, or so I'm able to prioritize where I'm looking for the most important information to help me make my decision. So I think that's something to just consider, the fact that it's very legal, lots of legal writing, lots of technical writing, that when you're asking civilians to participate in this, you want to make sure they're best set up for success. Yeah, and as someone who came into this with no legal experience at all, it definitely was a learning curve. But we want people that are coming not just from legal backgrounds, and so just really thinking about how you're setting people up to best understand the content. As you may talked a little bit about with the reasonable person standard and how in the PRB, that more of the votes come from the police. Cases are really heavily weighted in favor of the police with the reasonable person standard, because we are judging it based on what the RU manager has decided is the verdict of the case. And so I think obviously this body is intending to adjust some of that power dynamic imbalance in this new system, but just wanted to note that as an important barrier that we have constantly faced, and what has made it difficult for our committee to really earn the trust of the community, because they don't feel like they feel it's weighted not in their favor. Also, involved officers don't show up. So a big part of the picture is missing without their testimony. Usually the appellant will be there, the RU manager, and then, people from IPR, of course, people from the Bureau, but the actual officer involved in the case doesn't come. And I'm not 100% sure on the full history. I'm sure Mr. Handelman could inform you all, but at least in my time, they haven't come. And I know it was encouraged that they don't go. And so just thinking about what that means for future cases, like how should that officer be involved in that process is worth discussing. And then there's one process thing that we do that I think is really important, which is that we discuss the completeness of the file before we go into the appeal. I just find that that's an important step that your process should have. Just making sure that you feel like you have all the information you need to make the decision before you start deliberating and going into the decision. It's like a two-step process. First, we deliberate on the completeness, and then we vote on if we think that it is complete. And then we go into actually deliberating the facts of the case. So that was a step that I thought would be important for you all to keep in some way. As far as policy review and proposals for changes, I would first say, often we're trying to make policy proposals with very little support from the city in terms of research, staff time, and context. Hopefully, just the fact that this new board would be very well funded could offer some more capacity to support these civilians in trying to make policy proposals. But right now it's just, we're kind of usually scraping to get information and put together something that is meaningful and can be helpful, and just on very little resources. But then also proposals often don't go anywhere. And so a lot of time and energy gets wasted, which can feel demoralizing. So I know there's what's the word? There's something in the charter amendment for this that talks about how, there needs to be some kind of a response. I think that is really important, because not only are we under-resourced in making these recommendations, but then it's like they don't really go anywhere. I know, like, we put together a 40-page report on the 2020 protests, and even though I knew that it wasn't really going to go anywhere, it was still important for us to do it, to have like a record of what the community was saying, and to put on record, what we thought needed to change, but still can feel really hard to put in all that work and not see it go anywhere. So thinking about how the city is helping to move forward the things that this new body proposes, how you implement that structure and change that culture is going to be really important. And then also for the directives right now, they often offer these comment periods that we usually don't get communicated to us until the very last minute, if at all. And then it's like, you have 2 weeks to provide comment. And, you know, as volunteers who we only meet once or twice a month, 2 weeks to put together, to look at something and put together recommendations within that time frame just does not work. So just thinking about how that process could be more expansive so that it's not just these tiny little windows that people can barely offer any comment. That would be something worth exploring. And then as far as methodologies for gathering community input, a couple of tips. Build a list of partners that you regularly turn to for outreach. That was what Irene Konev did for 13 years for IPR. And she, you know, was able to cultivate those relationships externally that she could lean on when we wanted to seek community feedback. So that's a really important part of what this, you know, new office and board should be setting up an infrastructure for. Training your facilitators. Do not take community input facilitation lightly. It's not just a throw something together and say, oh, everybody just show up to this meeting and tell us what you think. It needs to be structured. It needs to have facilitators that are trained and that know how to deal with various situations that could occur, especially depending on the topics. We've had some testy topics and people are really emotional, and you need to have a good facilitator that's prepared for that. So that there's a greater success in your events. Having starter questions, having guides with expectations, all of that. Also pretty common sense, but breaking people up into small groups to allow for more discussion and making sure that you not only have a facilitator, but you have a note taker for all of those groups at a very bare minimum. But it's also good to just have another third person to help monitor the conversation and deal with any issues and help the facilitator, you know, navigate whatever's going on in the discussion. So just, again, being really prepared to have enough staff and people, volunteers, whoever that is, to absorb what you're hearing from the community so that they feel like their time hasn't been wasted and they feel that you are genuinely capturing everything that they're coming to tell you. Meeting people where they are, so go to their communities to get their feedback. This is a very common thing as well, to not expect that people just come to you, you know, find ways to, again, with turning to those partnerships that you create, but also physically meeting people where they are is important when gathering input. And then having structured outcomes so that you're asking the right questions to get the most valuable feedback. So again, it's not just a, you know, let's just have a free for all, everybody just come and tell us what you think. What do you actually want to learn? What are the things that you need to learn in order to make certain decisions or to, you know, make certain recommendations? Being really structured about those outcomes will help you ask the right questions. And again, will make the community feel like they've actually been heard and that their feedback was valued. A couple of just CRC recent accomplishments. So I mentioned that we wrote that 40-page report. It was a lot of hard work, but it was totally worth it, despite the fact that it didn't really go anywhere as far as any, you know, one in the city really taking any of those recommendations and doing anything with them. But again, it was us putting on the record what happened in 2020 that needed to be documented and look at best practices for what needs to change. We changed our work group structure to be more responsive. And I think in general too, we're having a bit of this conversation, like, you don't need to have stagnant work groups. Like if there's a thing that you all don't need to do anymore, change up the work groups. What does the community want? How do you respond to what they're asking for? Structure your work groups in that way. And we started meeting up with commissioners again through our liaisonship program. And I think that's important to have some kind of direct relationship with the commissioners, and have been moving forward our agenda on changing our standard of review, picking up where we left off several years ago. However, we still haven't been able to change the standard and it's not really a high priority. I mean, understandably so. Honestly, there's so much going on in the city. But that is an unfortunate challenge. We really want to get that. We want to change that standard now so that we can kind of test it out in advance of this new board, because that'll be a big culture shift for the Bureau. And we think we could be an opportunity, the CRC, to test that out. Work groups are supposed to work on policy recommendations, but many of them struggle to meet and put forth anything. And then again, like any other committee of volunteers, it's difficult to get people to stay engaged and work on projects in between meetings. So it takes, a really strong leadership to, keep trying to get people to show up and accomplish their goals. And so that's like any advisory body or any group of people really. But that's been a challenge for us over the years for sure. And when we have hearings, it's really hard to do anything else. So we kind of get sometimes get behind on all that other work when we're caught up in hearings, because again, as volunteers, those case files are hundreds of pages, and there's only so much you can ask from volunteers, especially this is a really valuable and important need for the city to have some kind of process for police accountability. So we carry the weight of that expectation, and it takes a lot out of us. So, I know I've expressed this along the way with this new board. You really got to consider the toll that this takes on anyone that does it, and make sure that they're very well supported, whether that's financially, emotionally. It's a big burden, and we want to make sure that people can stay, and that doing that active retention work is going to be critical in this next board. And then IPR is transitioning out of the auditor's office, which has just created instability, as well as just the fact that we're trying to transition into this new system. And, the timelines, they're not all syncing up. And so, of course, that's just creating hardship for everybody, including the CRC. So that's our presentation. I'll go ahead and stop screen sharing here. And yeah, we are eager to hear your questions and happy to answer them.
Thank you so much. We'll now take questions and let Candace and you may respond to them. Please keep your questions brief. Please allow me to facilitate this Q&A, and please ask questions that help the commission move towards identifying barriers and best practices, which is the purpose of this work phase. So I will be glad to go ahead and facilitate this conversation. Thank you.
I'll just take that first question I see here in the chat box of, are there organizations that you work with that can help train community members to be facilitators? When I first joined the CRC, I was on the crowd control and use of force, and we put together this community input session at PSU. I was working at PSU at the time. That is what I did. I facilitated things. I was a teacher, so I kind of just leaned on my own personal experience. But over the years, we did get some support from Race Talks. They are very skilled in training facilitators, especially to have difficult conversations. So they are a really great organization to look towards for not only support in training people, but they have an access to a network of people who do facilitation for their meetings, and would be a great first start. And I'm sure they've got ideas for other organizations. That's just the one that comes to top of mind. And then of course, PSU, I think is a great resource just down the street from City Hall. Lots of people there that you can lean on for all kinds of things, but especially facilitation support.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Faith.
Hi, good evening. Tonight we've talked a lot about sort of the technical documents, what goes into an investigation, what you're presented with. And I'm really curious around sort of the relational element of what it's like being on your commission. Like how important is that interrelationship with one another in terms of making decisions or making recommendations? And I know you can't probably do like a perfect math ratio on this, but like how much would you say when you're in the commission, you're utilizing those relationship skills versus the technical knowledge and expertise that you've learned through training around reviewing case files? And I'm just trying to think of, as we get into the recommendation phase, how do we prepare people to understand that component of it as well as the technical component?
Well, as someone who worked in student affairs and worked with teaching and educating young people, I'm always going to harp on the fact that relationships are literally everything. And you cannot escape the fact that if the people that you have to work with, you don't have a good relationship with, it's going to affect your work no matter what. So I think that's a very core tenet of any group of people, but especially a group of people that have to come together and make really tough decisions on technical and political, things. So that's something that I know in my time on the CRC, I've worked on, just trying to build the camaraderie amongst ourselves as a group, because if I know you and have some kind of a relationship with you, I will assume your best intentions a lot better. When it comes to we're having like a heated debate on something, or we're disagreeing on an issue in the case file, I'm going to approach that with much more kindness and with a clearer head if I, know like, Yume and I, we're going to go like get a drink after or whatever, right? I mean, we don't really do that sometimes.
Sometimes we want to.
Sometimes we definitely want to, but you know what I mean? Like just knowing that that person is someone who has the same values that you have to be in this work really eases those tensions that can arise when, again, you're making really tough decisions. So yeah, 100% you need to prioritize that, and that's something that you all, are doing as a board, right? I'm sure you had tons of retreats and relationship and icebreakery type things, and all of that work really matters. And so that's like standard, I think, but especially I think we've also tried to do a lot more going a little bit deeper to understand people's intentions and their background. I know we had a recent retreat. It was just like a little Zoom thing that Irene facilitated, and it was really simple, but really impactful, because I felt like I learned so much about my peers on the commission, about like what brought them to this work, why they were motivated to be here. Because, you got to be a certain kind of person and want to do this kind of work. And even though we all had really disparate backgrounds, you could see the values kind of emerge and the roots that we all shared. So being real intentional about how you create those conversations can really affect the work. And Yume, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that is super important, especially because we do not have a ton of time in the meetings oftentimes to, exchange pleasantries. I also think it's important to underline that when that doesn't work, those failures are very public, right? And so, if you do have a conflict with someone, you end up on the news, which if anyone's been watching the news this last year, we've had some issues with. So, there's that saying, our successes are private, our failures are public. And I think that is very much the case for, an advisory body or an appellate body like this. I also think it's important to prioritize that, because so much of your effort in the room goes towards the technical component, right? We get maybe 20 hours of training before joining the CRC, and you basically become an attorney. You have to know so much about the law, so much about the Bureau's culture. And so all of your effort is going to go into that, is going to go into, trying to navigate those things. So if you don't know the people that you're working with, if you don't have opportunities outside of that to build community, I think it's very difficult because you're operating in a silo. I also think, one of the things that I struggle with is, I am a pretty outspoken proponent of police reform, and I do a lot of the PRBs for CRC. So that means that sometimes the people I see the most are cops. That's who I see on multiple times in a week. And so trying to walk that line of collegiality with people that you're going to have to be in review with, without necessarily sacrificing your impartiality, I think that's a struggle. I think that's the thing that you have to really be careful about.
Thank you. So we have time for the two questions for Commissioner Charlie and Commissioner Monica. I'm sorry, Dan, unfortunately, and Lavisa, we won't be able to take your questions. So thank you for understanding. I deeply appreciate that. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you, Candace, for all this information. I really appreciate it. And I wanted to ask, you mentioned that the police are encouraged to not show up. Can you expand on that? Like who encourages, and what can we do to remove, remove that barrier, I guess? I know there's
Yeah,
no simple answer, but
there isn't, I think, and some of this just predates me, so there might be some cultural context that I just don't know. But from my time, it was my understanding that the union started telling the employees to not attend the CRC hearings. I don't know when that happened, but that's what I understand was the source. I'm not sure what their reasoning was exactly, but yeah, that's the dynamic that we're dealing with. And so in my whole time that I've been here, never once has an officer showed up. And I know it's been like that for a while, but I don't know all the history. And I don't know how to solve that. I don't know how to solve that. So yeah.
Thank you.
Complicated.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Monica.
I heard you say earlier that you, at the end of your meetings or at the end of your work, oftentimes propose policy that doesn't go anywhere, were your words. And so what do you think we would need for that policy to go somewhere? What are the barriers there? What's happening there?
I mean, I think it's multifaceted. I think it's not all intentionally like malicious per se. I think a lot of stuff falls through the cracks at the city right now and in general. And there's lots you could say about just how the city's government functions that affects this. Obviously, I have a lot of opinions on that since I'm on the charter review. But I think, you know, there has to be some incentive or some, I don't know, leverage thing that you all have to force the commissioners to consider your proposals. I mean, you know, for that 40-page report that we did go to the council, we presented it to them and made sure it got on the record and all of that, which is helpful. It helps raise awareness too, as other people, you know, see that and hear the content. But there's just no like real bridge between like us and the commissioners who are responsible for implementing the changes, or even us in the bureau. And I think that's just partially deteriorated, what's the word, relationship between the bureau and these bodies over time, and also just dysfunction, frankly. So it's complicated, but I do think that you all should, I know it's a provision in the actual language. And sure, making them listen to you doesn't exactly translate into them doing something about it, but it's going to take more than just you in that relationship. It's really political pressure plays a role, persistence plays a role, and then just code and legal like obligations. So all of those are tools you can use.
Yeah, if I could add, Candace, I think, you know, the fact that we do not have a particularly robust support system for, you know, drafting legislation or suggesting language really hampers our effectiveness in putting forward a proposal. I also think that the fact that there are so many different advisory bodies, you know, we kind of joke about the alphabet soup of all these different organizations that are all sort of expected to jump and offer a policy proposal. I don't think a lot of them necessarily have the bandwidth to get a very well thought out proposal out the door if we suddenly get invited to weigh in on body cameras or something like that. It can be very difficult. So I think those are some challenges, making sure that you have the appropriate amount of institutional support really goes a long way. And I don't think that's a knock on IPR. I think that's just the way the system is set up.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I'm going to now take public comment on citizen review, on the citizen review committee, and on this briefing. We ask members of the public to keep their comments to 2 minutes in length and raise their hand in Zoom if you would like to speak. I see that there is a person who would like to speak, Rochelle Silver. I invite you to Go ahead and speak, Rochelle. Thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you. I was wondering if one of the members of the CRC could please elaborate on the appeals process from the appellant's point of view, particularly what rights the appellant has or doesn't have, and their ability to access investigatory information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So from the appellant's point of view, when a complaint first gets put in, I know IPR kind of talked you through like how it all moves through the system. It's very lengthy, that process. So already from the get-go, the appellant is put in a frustrating position to have a complaint take a really long time to get processed. So that's already at the beginning a hardship for the appellant. When it finally comes down to us being on the CRC, we're an appeals board. So if it comes to us, that's because the original ruling is being appealed by the appellant to have another opinion from us. And so already, we're not seeing a lot of these cases from appellants because only a small amount will actually appeal it to us after that first process. But once they come to to us, at that point, they, have gone through the lengthy process through IPR or PRB or whatever, wherever that intake started. And they don't get access to the case file. So they're not seeing everything that we're seeing. So that can put them at a disadvantage, of course, because they obviously have their side and whatever information they provided, but they're not listening to all the interviews that we're listening to. They're not seeing all of the reports. So we have so much more information than the appellant has. They just have their story and their documents. And then they do get a, why am I blanking? What is the name of the person that helps them? Help me out, you may.
An advocate.
Yeah.
An APA.
Yeah, an APA. Yeah, thank you. They do get an APA. So that is someone that can help them through the process. They don't act necessarily like a lawyer would, but can in some ways help them on that kind of legal side. But for the most part, are just like an advocate through the process. And so they get some support on that end. But once they come to us on the CRC, again, we've had all this information that we've reviewed. We have a reasonable person standard, which also already weights the decision in the police's favor. And then, they get a chance to speak, of course, and ask us questions, and we ask them questions. And then the decision gets made. And often even we don't know what happens. Like if we make a decision that changes the appeal ruling and it goes back and the chief approves it, we don't even hear like what happens after that. We don't hear what the discipline is. We don't hear anything. So then the appellant's not hearing that either. So it's, that's essentially, it's frustrating. It's very, they don't get a lot of information. There's very few opportunities that they have to share their story. They get like their interview with the IPR or the detective, and then with us. And then often they don't know the outcome, or the outcome gets weighted against them because of our standard.
And because it's an appellate process, right, there's not an opportunity for new information to come into play or anything along those lines. I do think a benefit of the process is, I think IPR's investigators are very thorough. I think they have a very high level of professionalism. I think it's evident, or at least I hope it's evident, that when you come before CRC, the members of the CRC are quite concerned about doing the right thing for the appellant and for the city. But it is maddeningly opaque in terms of what the appellant's going to see, whether or not they even know if the file is complete, that sort of thing. And like Candace said, I usually, when do I find out how a case went? When the IPR releases that report once a year. So it's difficult. That part is very difficult.
Thank you so much for that information, and thank you very much for the question. Any other public comment? All right, I'd like to, yes, open this up for discussion. And again, remembering our point for the discussion is identifying barriers or best practices. And that's the discussion that we really want to have. You said you wanted to answer Dan's question. So yeah, be glad to go ahead and answer Dan's question, and then you're wanting to do that discussion.
Yeah, I think this is just a good thing to highlight. Commissioner Dan asked what the emotional toll of reviewing deadly force cases is, and I can tell you honestly, it's quite high. Those cases are usually somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 pages of testimony. Best case scenario, we get 4 to 5 weeks with them. I've had cases come up where they're ready to go to review, and we don't want to hold up that process, and you get 2 weeks. So that's just a massive amount of just reading to do. But you're also looking at autopsy photos, you're looking at crime scene photos. You know, these are quite violent things, and you are weighing in your hands, the career of an officer, and you are weighing the death of a civilian, the death of a member of our community. That process is also very limited. It's very siloed, and it's very much to do with the specific directives, right? And so there's not a lot of space to deal with the broader picture of what policing is like for the city. There's not a lot of space to talk about just the truly tragic nature of some of these incidents. You are there to say, is this officer guilty of violating policy, right? And when you're talking about a officer involved shooting, that's often potentially a career-ending decision, right? And so I have found it to be very difficult. I think that emotional toll is quite high, and I think it's also frustrating because there are cases where you look at an officer and you say, if I would put myself in your shoes, I don't necessarily know that I would have made a different decision, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the broader picture is good, right? There are failures institutionally that can lead to this. There are failures in the Bureau's policies and procedures that can lead to this. But unless you can point to a very specific thing, it's very difficult to move any change on that. And when those things get released to the public, they often seem extremely bloodless, right? They seem like there's no concern about the person that died or the person who was shot. It's all procedural, and that's a feature of the process, not a bug, in my opinion. So I think that's frustrating. I've given that feedback to the Bureau repeatedly, and I think it would be good for a more open and robust discussion in those environments personally. But yeah, it takes a massive toll. I think I stress about those cases, and they don't go away when you sign off the Zoom call. You carry them with you for a long time.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, CMOB, Commissioner CMOB.
Hey, Yumi and Candace, what you guys just said, especially what you were talking about just now, Yumi, it is a very heavy thing to do, and making sure that you guys are supported, with your mental health and in some way. I take it there's nothing systems wise that's kind of built there to support you guys with this. So
no,
right. I mean, how would you suggest a feature like that be available for those that we would commission to the board? Because I see that as something incredibly important since you're bringing this up. I mean, autopsy photos, I've seen one in my life and I still can't shake it. That was a couple decades ago. So
I've seen a lifetime in the last 2 months, unfortunately. I think Candace probably has some thoughts on this as well, but I would say probably the biggest factor that would be helpful for this is just making sure that there's a robust way to staff this process. Right now, we are limited on CRC to 11 people, and those 11 people have to decide how they're going to give up their free time uncompensated to read a 1,000 to 2,000 page file, and then take on average 3 to 4 hours out of their day to hear that case. There aren't very many people that can do that on a regular basis. And so that means that you are, you know, a couple of us end up bringing the lion's share of that. And I think that can take a toll. I also think, you know, if you have one person who is heavily biased in one direction or another, they can end up having a mass and oversized impact on police accountability just by virtue of the fact that they're available in afternoons, right? So I think, I don't know that I do the work, and I you know, I volunteered for it. I don't know how much I would avail myself of mental health resources, although I think this would be helpful. But I think making sure that this is not something that is just done by a couple of people is probably more important. And that, truthfully, I think that means probably compensating people, you know, for their time, because it's expensive. I'm lucky that I have a job where I manage my office and I can basically make everyone's schedule revolve around mine for a few hours. But that's not something that Candace necessarily has the capacity to do in her job, and it's not something that a lot of people have. So I think addressing that elephant in the room, so to speak, is probably the most important thing, because if you can do that, you are not going to be limiting yourself to just a couple of people hearing those cases over and over again. Candace, did you have?
Yeah, I mean, I have been fighting this for years because I heard my first PRB case like a couple months ago, and I've been on the CRC for 5 years, and that's because at first you couldn't even review the cases. Only because of COVID has this become available. You couldn't even review the cases other than in person. Our CRC cases, we've always, at least on my time, have been able to review them online. So I can do it on my own time, you know, after work, usually like 10 o'clock at night kind of thing. Whereas you had to go to the office and downtown and read the case while being monitored as you're reading the case. And you have to do it, you know, ideally during their work hours. But again, I mean, I'm not going to take PTO to go read a case file. And so you try to do it in the evening, but it's limited. So like, I didn't have access to that process. The meetings were during the day, and then just reviewing the case was impossible. And so only recently have I been able to participate. So totally agree that just in general, like the city isn't always great about considering like our schedules. I get that there are employees that it's like, this is during their work day, right? And it's like, for them, it's like, well, I don't want to work after hours. And I totally get that. But if you want volunteers to be a part of any of these processes, you have to consider their schedules first, because I have a day job. It's not my day job to do this work. And that has been a constant fight that we've had. The last thing I'll just say is the other thing that I have struggled with, and all the boards struggle with, is there's not a solid infrastructure for how we get support from the city. Only recently did I learn that I have access to certain HR resources. I was told my whole time that I didn't have access to those things. So when we have conflicts on the board, it's like, where do you go to? Like in a normal workspace, you have like an HR that can help you with if you need a formal process, or if you just need, you know, some kind of ombudsman or some arbiter to help you through those conflicts. We don't have that. It's just like, good luck, deal with it on your own. And so the city really like needs to consider, what does it mean to be a volunteer for the city on these boards, especially a board like this one? And how do we have access to the same resources that employees have, whether that's HR, whether that's mental health services, you know, compensation, of course. But that has been a very blurry line. And I think that's one thing you should talk with the city about, and it affects all the boards, but especially this board. How do we get access to those same resources employees do? Because we need them.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your wisdom, your knowledge, and your passion around this work. Really just want to give you big kudos and deep gratitude for what you have brought to us this evening. I'm going to go ahead and ask for next steps from Lavisa, and then do a quick parking lot review from Victoria, and then close us out. And yes, CMOB says giant hugs, and yes, we all give you giant hugs and deeply appreciate your time and expertise. Thank you.
I agree, and I can't say thank you enough, Candace and Yumi. Thank you so much for the work you've done, and thank you so much for being here with us tonight and just giving us such incredible information. We really, really appreciate it, and we hope you'll come back. Next steps, everybody. Thank you so much for once again all the time that you're putting into these meetings. We do still need volunteers for subcommittee meetings. We're going to have 2 subcommittees this phase, community engagement and research. And if you think that you would be interested in being on a subcommittee, please email us and let us know by Thursday. I don't think we gave a deadline last time. We are giving a deadline this time. It is Thursday. Do it tonight if you're so inclined. Community engagement in particular, if you'd like to be involved in structuring the questions that we're asking community members. If you think you'd be great at that, please, please, please volunteer. We really need you. And also, actually, even negative replies are requested. So if you do not want to be on a subcommittee, please email and say, I can't be on a subcommittee, or I'm not interested in being on a subcommittee this phase. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner Lavisa. Facilitator Victoria, do we have anything in the parking lot this evening?
Thank you. And also will say that I have 2 things, and then I will also share what other notes, but I have the co-chairs will talk and see if how they can bring the IPR presenters again. They also, the question about looking into resources for training more facilitators from community. And then the 2 questions on investigators and recruitment, makeup of the investigators and when the UC works, it needs to change about it, and what the ideal candidate is and what attributes they look for. Anything in the hire process that ensures a candidate has no conflict of interest, trauma-informed, bias, awareness, etc.
Beautiful, Victoria. Thank you so very much for that. I think we are at our end this evening. If we can have the last slide up, if that's a possibility. Our thank you slide. But I can go ahead and share that, Victoria, if that works. Oh no, there it is. Yay. All right, thank you for all of you for your contributions today. Thank you also to the interpreters supporting access to the meeting, the Police Accountability Commission and its subcommittees for all Portlandiers. Thank you for thank you to the members of the public for being here and contributing your questions and thoughts. You can give written public comment in advance of future meetings at tinyurl.com /PortlandPAC comment. Please sign up for email updates at the Police Accountability Commission at tinyurl.com /PortlandPAC updates. This meeting is adjourned at 9:08. Thank you again so very much.